about those who remain silent and indifferent, or those who provided pseudoscientific rationale for such behavior? How else can we explain, how else can we understand how normal men and women could live with, participate in, and defend such practices? We ask that you be fully present, breathe through your discomfort, keeping your eyes wide open, listen carefully, and trust us. Okay. And now, okay, sure. We will light the chalice. The words should appear on you. There they are. Welcoming all free seekers of truth and meaning, gather to excite the human spirit, to inspire its growth and development, and to respond morally and ethically to a troubled world, and to sustain a vital and nurturing religious community.
Our readings today come from the book Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America. The foreword was written by Congressman John Lewis, whose words I'll share later. But first are the words from Leon Litwack. The use of the camera to memorialize lynchings testified to their openness and to the self-righteousness that animated the participants. Not only did photographers capture the executions themselves, but also the carnival-like atmosphere and the expectant moods of the crowds. Regarding the lynching of Thomas Brooks, Fayette County, Tennessee, 1915, quote, at a number of country schools, the day's routine was delayed until boy and girl pupils could get back from viewing the lynching. The public burning of a Negro was known as Negro barbecue, reinforcing the perception of Blacks as less than human. Many photographs of lynchings and burnings would reappear as popular picture postcards and trade cards to commemorate the events. A Unitarian minister in New York, John Haynes Holmes, he served Community Church and was a co-founder, incidentally, of the NAACP and the ACLU. When Holmes opened his mail one day to find a postcard depicting a crowd in Alabama posing for a photographer next to the body of a Black man dangling by a rope, responding to the minister's recent condemnation of lynching, the person who sent the card wrote, "This is the way we do them down here. The last lynching has not been put on card yet. We'll put you on our regular mailing list. Expect one a month on average." From Congressman Lewis. Many people today, despite the evidence, will not believe, don't want to believe, that such atrocities happened in America not so very long ago. What is it, he asked, what is it in the human psyche that would drive a person to commit such acts of violence against their fellow citizens? We must prevent anything like this from ever happening again.
As we entered the monument at the Peace and Justice Memorial Center in Montgomery, it dawned slowly what we would actually be confronting. A peaceful garden welcomed us, but then there was the wall, listing the names and date and location of deaths of 24 men and women who were lynched or killed in racially motivated attacks in the 1950s. I had a visceral reaction. I could feel heaviness in my chest and abdomen as I perused the names and dates. It was similar to the feelings I had experienced the day before at the Legacy Museum, the Museum of the Legacy of Slavery, where an exhibit of heads and shoulders were at floor level, surrounded by waves. More than 2 million of the 12 million people transported from Africa are believed to have died on the trip. I was most deeply affected by the sculpture of the head of and shoulders of a mother who held one child at her breast and another by the hand as they sank below the waves. It is almost impossible to describe the expression on her face, a mixture of despair and sorrow and helplessness and resignation. And my body reacted strongly. My breasts felt as though they were preparing to feed a child. Heaviness weighed me down, chest and abdomen. Nervous energy buzzed through my arms. This is a horror so great that I almost cannot look at it. And yet, I know I must. We were confronted with such horrors over and over during our week in Montgomery. And I think that was the point of being there. It was structured so that we visited a museum every day. And I felt assaulted by the horrors, the numbers, the images, and the emotions that flooded through me. I sometimes think of anti-racist work as like peeling an onion, except it seems to be an infinite onion. There is always another layer, another discovery, another awakening to the privileges and simple safety that we white people take for granted. It is humbling, it is devastating, it is visceral. It builds empathy to be confronted yet again by the suffering endured by African Americans and others of color in our country. I have been participating in anti-racism training and UUA programs now for probably 3 decades. It has taken a long time, but finally we are becoming a little more multicultural, seeing more people of color in our congregations, more people of color active in the denomination and in leadership roles. The Buddhists have a saying, "Let us take a long, loving look at what is real." This trip was another layer. I understand on a whole new visceral level what people of color in our country have experienced and still continue to experience. Yet I cannot nor will I speak for them, but I will try to keep looking, to not look away, to allow myself to be assaulted and horrified over and over again, in order to acknowledge and honor their lived experience.
The power of history is in telling the truth. The words that we've included at the top of your orders of service are on the home page of the Legacy Museum website. The power of history is in telling the truth. And that's what they were doing in Montgomery, telling the truth. It seems to be making a difference there. In Montgomery and beyond, the invitation is to listen, to look, to see, to trust, to engage with compassion. It seems as if truths, hard truths of the past, of the present, are neither hidden or denied in Montgomery. Truths are told at the Legacy Museum about the transatlantic slave trade, the domestic slave trade, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and today's tragedies, travesties of mass incarceration and police brutality, of the endless legacy in this country of brutalization and dehumanization of Black human beings. From the moment we entered the museum into a darkened room lit only by waves crashing against the wall before us, it was as if we were there in one of the hundreds of slave ships that for more than 200 years crossed the Atlantic, the first of which sailed from northern ports and later were joined along the entire eastern coast of the United States. But we were seeing and hearing the sound of sun-tipped waves pounding against a sheet of glass. It is unlikely that those who were packed, huddled in the holds, saw even a glimmer of light. From that first moment when we entered to the last, which was a space for reflection, where we were invited to sit and listen to the soothing words of an old hymn, "There is a balm in Gilead." From the first to last, the experience was visceral, chilling, sorrow-filled, question-filled. How? Why? I thanked a guard for being there. She said it had been hard at first, but that over time it was so important to hear the stories. At some point in our conversation, I remarked that the experience of being in the Legacy Museum was for me so different from being at the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., which is also profound and evocative, but relatively less emotionally evocative. Her response: "We are standing where they stood." At that very moment, we were standing where they had stood, after being herded from trains that brought them. We walked where they had walked. We stood where they had been sold. Adult woman, about 23, reliable, cooks well, has infant optional, price negotiable. We stood where Rosa Parks stood as she waited for the bus. There wasn't time to read the historic markers, but I was gratified to learn that some time ago, markers that commemorated Montgomery's place as the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement and Montgomery's shameful role as a primary market of the domestic slave trade. These new markers, these recent markers that also told the truth, they told, the ones that they joined were of Montgomery's past as the birthplace of the Confederacy. The power of history is in telling the truth. We walked to the Civil Rights Memorial, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, on streets past houses where those participating in the bus boycott had surely walked. Enough had to have been enough, more than enough, for those people to have braved what they did. What determination, what resilience, and communal support it must have taken to persist with little or no transportation for a year. I still feel a sense of joy and exhilaration as I recall victories of the civil rights movement. Before climbing the last flight of steps that lead to its entrance, I caught my breath at the sight of the fountain. This is the memorial. Inside the building, which we'd be going in retrospect, are the details of this. It's the fountain in its setting that is moving. Flanked by words from Martin Luther King and engraved in that circular fountain are the names, dates, and causes of the deaths of 41 martyrs to civil rights, some of whom are named in this photographic detail. It's also on a postcard, the one they sell at the museum. In order of death dates from the bottom, we see 3 familiar names: Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Reeb, and Viola Liuzzo. Inside, we see these images of these 3 who are associated with our faith. I was happy to be present in Selma for the 50th anniversary, when representatives of the families of James Reeb, Jimmy Lee Jackson, and Viola Liuzzo accepted the UUA's Courageous Love Award. Words from that ceremony say well why they have been enshrined in UU as well as United States history.
The Living Legacy Project board, and very happy to see so many of us here to honor the families of the 3 martyrs of the Selma Voting Rights Campaign. Each of these families lost a loved one in the course of the struggle to obtain voting rights for all Americans. Viola Liuzzo lost her life along Highway 80 between Selma and Montgomery. Her life was taken by people for whom hatred and violence were central to their lives. The Reverend James Reeb lost his life as the result of a beating on Washington Street in Selma, where some of us stood just yesterday. His life was cut short by haters who could not tolerate their social order being altered. Jimmy Lee Jackson lost his life to premeditated police violence in Marion, Alabama. His life was shortened, was ended, when an Alabama state trooper shot him as he attempted to protect his mother and grandfather from police violence. We need to acknowledge that the rest of us would not be here today if it were not for the losses inflicted on these families. These were not voluntary losses. I'm certain that Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Reeb, and Viola Liuzzo wanted to go on living. But because they valued justice and practiced love, they were willing to place themselves in harm's way. The loss of these 3 lives appears to have been the price that purchased the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This nation, including all of us here, owes an astronomical debt to these families.
Come with us now to the National Peace and Justice Memorial. Described as the greatest work of American architecture of the 21st century, it was just a short uphill bus ride from the Legacy Museum with which it's connected. Among the first words we saw after passing between the tall gray walls that frame the entrance to the memorial are those that Linda read at the beginning of this service. We will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. With faith, because we shall overcome. We shall overcome. Throughout much of my life, I have been singing that song, seeking justice, sharing hope, and weeping every time we sang and sometimes marched. Now, here we were on holy ground, and I was weeping because the truth is so hard. I had watched commentaries when the memorial was inaugurated 5 years ago, and I had wept. It's a place to grieve in broad daylight, someone wrote. It's a place, I would add, where the sorrow and rage and all of the hows and whys of the earlier hours of the day came together in me. I was finally at this place where I had felt since I knew it was there that I needed to stand. I was filled with awe as I stood at the base of the hillside upon which the centerpiece of the memorial rests. After a time, alone, and in the surrounding silence, I began walking up the hill, stopping to look at details and to explore the space visually. Finally, I arrived in a virtual forest of rust-colored Corten steel structures, all of them pretty close to the color of dried blood. There are 810 of them, each representing a county in mostly, but not only, southern states where documented lynchings took place, each with dates and names along with the lists of the unknown of 4,400 Black spirits. How must it have been? How could it have been? How is it still to live in fear, in a constant state of danger, of never knowing what could lead to one's death, or to the death, or torture, or unjust incarceration of one's beloveds? How could it have been? How is it still to withstand the injustice, the inhumanity, the precariousness of living day to day? These were my thoughts as I read inscription after inscription of those monuments to humanity and to man's inhumanity to man. I regretted that my time was so limited that I wouldn't have time to read every line, and in my own small way to honor every one of the dead. Excuse me. After a time, there was a turn, and we were who that day's witnesses began this downhill walk. As we descended, the tops of the monuments remained at the same level as those that were on the ground when we entered. I asked a guard about the significance of the tops being at the same level. He said, "It's to show we're all equal." There was another turn, more monuments high above, and along the wall plaques documenting just a few of the lynchings, testaments to the insanity, the capriciousness, the danger of a mob or of a single angry human being. And this is just a few of those that we saw.
Growing up in a small town in what I affectionately think of as outer Kansas, I was pretty oblivious to what was happening with regard to race in the larger world. The South seemed far away, and we were not like those bad people who had perpetrated slavery. In American history, in my senior year of high school, I was taught that the Civil War was not about slavery. It was about economics. Phew, that made life a little easier, at least then. Now, I realize it was one of the illusions we white people told ourselves so that we didn't have to face the reality of life for Black slaves. I lived in Kansas for 22 years, born in 1950. In my little town, I was barely aware of racism, barely aware when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. He was some unknown to us Black person who lived far away and was causing trouble with a lot of demonstrations. I did know that people of color were not allowed to live west of Main Street in my town, and all the Black kids went to Washington School for the elementary years and junior high, I believe. So you sure didn't want to buy a house in a neighborhood where you'd have to go to Washington School. And Negroes weren't allowed to live in the public housing complex I lived in from 2nd through 8th grade. Though we did play Little League sports with them. But it was just the way it was. We didn't think much about it. We were, after all, good Christians who sent money to Africa so that they could be converted to Christianity and wouldn't have to go to hell after they died. There is a French proverb, "The fish is the last to know water." In Montgomery, at the Peace and Justice Center, we entered the area where the Corten steel rectangles hang. As I recall, one must look up to read them, as though the souls have departed to heaven. As I walked through, I desperately wanted to not find a rectangle that said Kansas. And actually, I never did. I desperately wanted not to have any guilt by association. I thought we Kansans were part of the good people, that slavery and ill treatment of Black people was done by those bad, ignorant people in the South. I had already been chagrined the day before at the Legacy Museum when I learned how much the wealth of the northeastern cities had been based on the slave trade. After all, I live in New England, and again, It's those bad people in the South who are so racist. They are the ones who practiced slavery. We championed abolition of slavery. Not so fast. All that wealth we glorify in Newport and Boston and New York City, go back a few centuries, much of that wealth was based on the slave trade. It's an unhappy revelation of our complicity. We cannot say it is only them, only those bad Southerners. Suddenly, that wealth in Newport does not seem so glamorous. Back at the Peace and Justice Memorial, when I got to the last section where the monuments list towns and cities who have erected plaques to acknowledge the lynchings that occurred there was the plaque for a lynching in Atchison, Kansas. And it reads, Community Remembrance Project, Lynching of George Johnson, Atchison, Kansas. On January 4th, 1870, a mob of at least 50 white men lynched a black man named George Johnson in Atchison, Kansas. 5 days prior, Mr. Johnson had accidentally injured a white man while hunting. In fear of the retaliatory violence often inflicted on black people by white mobs, Mr. Johnson fled the scene. Shortly after, Mr. Johnson surrendered himself to local authorities and was held in the jail at 6th and Santa Fe. The county attorney indicated that criminal charges against Mr. Johnson for the shooting were unlikely, as his only alleged crime was fleeing the scene. On January 4th, it was rumored that a lynch mob was coming for Mr. Johnson that night, but law enforcement refused to take precautions in order to protect him. At 11:30 p.m., the white mob broke into the jail with no resistance from the deputy on duty and shot at Mr. Johnson 3 times. Then the mob placed a rope around Mr. Johnson's neck, beat him, and dragged him to the intersection of 4th and Commercial, where the mob fired several more shots into Mr. Johnson's body. Despite the gruesome torture, Mr. Johnson was still alive. The mob carried him to the 5th Street Viaduct, where they hanged him. Even though a massive crowd of at least 2,000 witnesses were present, no one was ever indicted or held accountable for the lynching of George Johnson. Atchison County, Kansas, 2021. So much for my innocence by association.
Listening is not an act of the ear. Listening is an act of the heart.
In these times, when so much speaks, outrage, anger, disillusionment,
Rage is a constant cry. Derision has found his voice. The despair of the fair and faithful speaks fast and often. the whisper of despair grows into a keening lament.
Open our hearts to the real fears of those who have known hate, because they are our guides to its insidious expansiveness.
Open our memories to those ancestors of our spirits who were love seekers, peacemakers, truth guiders, system questioners, and listen because
Listening is an act of our hearts.
do not ignore the soul pain of the ones who move through the hardest nights, who face the denial of their rights and the desecration of their humanity. Do not forget those too dispossessed of a language of mastery and the countless forms of life who do not count humanity as their family, and yet who are within our larger circle of interdependence.
Open our hearts to the true threats that many feel.
Open our minds to the anguish of those who need accompaniment.
Open our memories to those who came before us and taught us how to create new forms of love out of old, worn patterns.
And listen, because listening is an act of our hearts. Listening is an act of our hearts. Let's do that one more time. Listening is an act of our hearts. Listening.
Let us turn inward for a time of prayer and meditation. O love that will not let us go, Spirit of life, God of many names and none, we seek to create a community of love and justice where you flow through and among us, where we share our lives and our goods so that all may have enough and none go without the necessities of life. As we have shared the joys and sorrows of our lives, we rejoice and give thanks for new revelations and insights. For 60th birthdays, for the love of pets, for health care, especially when we have new breakthroughs, and for community, where we can give and receive comfort and consolation for those things which cause suffering, especially the death of loved ones. For we know that joys shared are multiplied and sorrows shared are halved. We bring to our service today humble and contrite hearts. May we have the courage to take that long, loving look at what is real, so that we might honor the reality of the suffering of all people, but especially that caused by racism which harms our brothers and sisters. May we allow the new knowledge we gain on this journey to increase our empathy for the suffering of the past and the present. May we have the humility and fortitude to explore repentance, confessing the harm which we have allowed and sometimes participated in. May we face squarely into the sacrifices that reparation might require of us, in faith that the rewards of such sacrifice will be a world of justice and peace. May we continue to hope for and march for and work for the world of which we dream, where all human beings are beloved, where they feel safe and are safe, and where they have enough food and shelter and clothing and education and medical care and love. Always love. A world where justice rolls down like water and love is an ever-flowing stream. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.